here in my hand. But let me begin by welcoming you all on behalf of the Department of Asian Studies. My name is Ross King. I teach Korean language and linguistics and Korean studies in the department. Our acting head, Bruce Rusk, had wanted to be here this evening to welcome you and indeed to hear the lecture, but he's now under the weather and could not make it. He sends his regrets. Before I turn over the floor to our guest speaker, I do have a couple items of business, and one of which is to maneuver my way around these slides with this cantankerous, there we go. Oh, well, that's me once again. So I am your moderator. And then you will have figured out by now that this is the program. So we hope to go no later than 7 with the actual formal lecture portion of the evening, and then have a good half hour for Q&A. There we go. And before we go any further, I should also acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and we're very grateful to be here. Okay, so a little bit of background about the lecture. So I am now just a civilian back in the trenches teaching in Asian studies, but approximately 12, 13 years ago, I had the privilege of serving as head of the Department of Asian Studies, and we had our 50th anniversary coming up. The department was founded in 1961, and we'll hear more about that shortly, but as one of the events for this big 50th anniversary bash, somehow in the years preceding 2011, 2012, I came to know a number of you who are in the room, Gary Matson, for example, and it quickly emerged that of the various activities in the Department of Asian Studies in the various geographic areas, the Japan Studies sector, if you will, had more than the others, in fact, a really pretty tightly networked group of graduates that were still in touch, and all of whom in one way or another were indebted to Professor John Howes, both for their education and for the relationships they had. And so we collectively, thanks to many of these alumni, these graduates of the department, came up with this idea of an annual lecture in the name of Professor John Howes, in Japanese studies. And we've had a number now. I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure. This must be the 12th or the 13th. I think 2012, the academic year 2011, 2012 would have been the first one. But this is really the first one where we have an opportunity to hear something about Professor Howes himself. So then if I could, come on, there we go. A very brief introduction to our speaker this evening. So Andrew Horvat is one of those deshi, one of those many deshi of Professor Howes. He had his BA is from this department and his MA is from this department, and those were in literature, and he has translated Japanese literature into English. Went on to be to a very distinguished career as a journalist for at least 2 decades, based in Tokyo, writing for some of the big outlets, Los Angeles Times, etc. And then sort of morphed into an academic career where he was, director of the Stanford Center in Kyoto for some years, and then most recently was teaching for a number of years at Josai International University. He is a wonderful storyteller. He has all kinds of interesting anecdotes and information, and just he's going to tell us a really interesting arc that I think brings together why so many people here tonight are in the room and why we're all connected to Japan and to John Howes. So without further ado, Andrew, the floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Horvat.
Ross, thank you very much for that exceedingly generous introduction. I will try to live up to it. And while I'm saying thank you to everyone, I should also thank especially Tad Hosoi, Gary Matson for their help with the with some with a hard disk which contains 60 hours of interviews between John Howes and his former students, the Deshi that Ross referred to. And I think that you will see them in this particular, oh yes, you can see some of the Deshi in John's house, and John is in the background, and he is holding forth. And these sessions lasted from 2011 to 2014. And I went through as many as I could, but I think I barely skimmed the surface. I'm greatly indebted because a lot of new information I didn't know about John was on those tapes, on those recordings. But it gives you an idea that John was a very special kind of university professor. It's not uncommon for university professors to have former students who keep in touch with them, but to have something like 30 or 40 people, that's how many we had in the last online memorial service in 2019, spread from as far south as New Zealand, some on the East Coast, and many in various positions in Japan, lawyers, et cetera, academics and business people and so on. There's a wonderful Japanese habit of saying ketsuron o saki ni dashimashou, meaning I'm going to tell you what my conclusion is, so that you don't have to wait for an hour. I'll tell you now. Basically, this department and all the students have been the unintended but most welcome beneficiaries of, or shall we say, the beneficiaries of the unintended but welcome consequences of American foreign policy, American Cold War foreign policy, in seemingly contradictory ways. I think you all know that, you've all heard about the Institute of Pacific Relations, IPR. This was founded in the 1920s in Honolulu, not coincidentally by Christians who wanted peace after World War I. And it progressed, it moved to New York, where it was heavily funded by all sorts of major foundations, until the middle of the 1950s, when certain US politicians decided that they wanted to go on a witch hunt and started looking for people who lost China. And they thought they saw virtually everyone in IPR as having been responsible. And this resulted in the defunding of this wonderful institution, which had a publication called Pacific Affairs, and had one wonderful library, and as its head was William Holland. And so, having been defunded, they were looking for a new home, and just at that time, UBC was looking for an Asian Studies department, and somehow IPR ended up becoming the beginnings of Asian Studies at UBC in 1961. And this was the negative outcome of the Cold War policies. The positive outcome was that in the 1950s, American policymakers decided that they really needed a bulwark against godless communism in Asia. And so they decided that, well, it's true that we did fight a war against Japan and they were terrible at that time, but it turns out that they're really actually very democratic and they're wonderful people, and once you get to know them. And so they decided that really they had to woo Japan to become part of the Western alliance. And this resulted in an enormous amount of foundation money and going into promoting good relations with Japan. And John Howes was one of those people who was very heavily involved in the dispersing of these funds, in the making of decisions, in a period sort of roughly between the time he became a PhD student at Columbia in 1950 to the time when he comes to UBC in 1961. So as you can see, the skills that he brought with him as a fundraiser and as a kind of a grassroots people-to-people diplomacy, people-to-people exchanges expert really helped us in enormous ways. So this is my conclusion. So let me go now into the details. Actually, who was John Howes? And who were his deshi, and why do they feel so beholden to him? And what did he do? What were his motivations? Why did he suddenly become this, well, not suddenly, but why did he become this person who saw himself very much as a bridge across the Pacific? The very words that Nitobe Inazo used to describe himself. Not coincidentally, Nitobe Inazo was one of the two Christian intellectuals, Japanese Christian intellectuals whom John decided to study to make his academic work. And one of them, by the way, is called Nitobe Inazo Bridge Across the Pacific. It's the result of a conference which was held at UBC and which resulted in an excellent set of papers. I have the book. I can say that it's a wonderful book, and it's really the go-to book for Nitobe Inazo materials. It was $49.50 in 1995 when it came out. I last checked on Amazon, and it was $223. And let me tell you, it's done a lot better than my investments. And I should have bought a few more copies. Okay, so who was John Howes, and what kind of a multifaceted career did he have? Well, he was, shock and surprise, a military intelligence officer, a cultural exchange specialist, historian, fundraiser, student mobility enthusiast. Did I leave some things out? Oh yes, he was a church organist, choir leader, and a railroad enthusiast, but that's another story. He was decorated in 2003 by the Japanese government for his contributions to the community. In that sense, the community meaning things like, I think you've seen the Asian Studies Center, which is actually the Sanyo Pavilion at Expo 17. Another professor was responsible for making that link between Sanyo and UBC, but John did an enormous amount to raise the funds to actually erect it. And so that was another one of his activities. And of course, then his book on Uchimura Kanzo, the other Christian intellectual, won a prize as well, and translated into Japanese, and so on. So what are the stories of the deshi? Who are they? I'm not going to mention names because it's not really fair, but I'll just give you some examples. There was one deshi who is now a very, very successful retired businessman, but he started off as a rather impecunious, that means not very well-off student. And John said, well, why don't you come and do some work from the garden? And he said, the deshi said, well, I was very good when it came to digging holes, but not so good when making stairs. But John said, that's okay. And he paid me. And then he decided, well, he wanted to study Japanese. So John arranged for him to go to Japan he needed funding. John was there to tell him what to apply for, what grant to apply for, how he should get into the business school. So, in other words, it was like everything was made possible by John. It's very similar to my particular story. When I came to UBC, as you will find out from my talk, that studying Japan was not really the flavor of the month. There were still bad memories about the war here, many of which were, of course, were based on racial prejudice, the forcible relocation of Japanese, but still, and Japan was not yet an economic superpower. So why are you why are you going off to study Japan? Or why are you going to study Japanese, period? So my first year, I was here, and my faculty advisor happened to be a rather colorful professor who said, first year Japanese? Oh, that's for second year students. You can't take that. So he sent me back by just 1 year immediately. And of course, we all know that the earlier you study a foreign language, especially a truly foreign language like Japanese, the better you are. But no. You don't. Creative writing, you don't want that. English 100 for you. So basically, this kind of attitude, this very conservative, almost reactionary attitude towards Asian studies was present at that time. And but I had the good fortune to take Introduction to East Asia from John, and then from Ogawa Hiroshi Sensei, I took Japanese, and somehow the word got around that I was doing pretty good at it. So he then arranged for me to apply for a World University Service scholarship. Shock and surprise, I got it. Another exchange tied to it to Keio University. Shock and surprise. Do you think maybe John had something to do with that? Anyway, and so on. So later on in my career, I was working as a journalist for the Associated Press, which is a wire service. Suddenly the phone rings. How would you like to become the Southam News correspondent for Asia, East Asia? Who is speaking? It's the manager, the general manager of Southam News. How did you know I exist? Oh, well, your professor, John Howes, spoke up at a meeting where a former ambassador to Canada, Nobuhiko Ushiba Nobuhiko, lambasted us for not having anyone in the Canadian media in Tokyo. So immediately our chairman said, get somebody. And sure enough, John Howes got up and said, well, my former student is, so there you see, this is a typical story of how John Howes basically was not only helping myself and a few others, but when you count the number of people, I mean, there's somebody here in the audience who was studying dentistry, ended up going for 2 months to Tokyo University on an exchange, and so on. The number of people who the so-called positive ripple effect of John's work here cannot be fully described. And in fact, somebody once said, why don't we sit down and look at all the couples that came together as a result of John's sending them to Japan, and then look at the children, and it'll kind of look like Schindler's List in a positive way, you know? So basically, that's one big reason why we have these lectures and why we want to memorialize him. Now, the word deshi, of course, is a Japanese word. It refers actually to a relationship of apprenticeship, but it now means how can I put it, the former students, the alumni. But the reason that we refer to it in this way is because we have this sense of bond of having been John's deshi. John often spoke, it's not by accident, John spoke about his research subjects, Nitobe Inazo and Uchimura Kanzo, these two Christian intellectuals, both born in early Meiji, actually 1860, actually late Edo, and becoming teachers themselves. And their deshi then occupy particularly high positions, positions of influence in diplomacy, in international exchange, in the upper echelons of Japanese society. And for example, one professor of president of Tokyo University, Yanaihara Tadao, was one of them. So when John gets his Fulbright in 1953, it's already known that he's studying Uchimara Kanzo. And the ship arrives in Yokohama, and there's somebody who wants to see him. He says, you have an appointment tomorrow at 3 p.m. with President Yanaihara of Tokyo University. Now, I don't know about you, but most scholarship students, including Fulbrighters, don't get this kind of a message right away. Well, why was it? Because of this deshi kanke, deshi relationship, which is a theme in much of John's own research. And it's a very, very important one because these networks are a key to understanding Japanese elite relationships and not so elite ones as well. And also, if you know how to utilize them in a practical sense, you will do well in Japan. So why Christian? Why particularly, why is John looking at Christian intellectuals in Japan? I mean, let's face it, the percentage of Christians in Japan is 1% or less than 1% of the population, at least those who declare themselves to be Christian. So this doesn't really seem to be a very fertile ground for research, unless you know that this 1% really is a significant 1%, and that they are responsible for, among other things, the founding of Sophia University, Aoyama University, Rikkyo University, ICU, Doshisha, Nanzan, and the list is of Japan's leading, very, very top private universities is long, and they contain, the very best of them are Christian, founded by Japanese Christians as well as Christian missionaries. The secret behind this, of course, is that there were so many restrictions on proselytizing of this formerly banned faith that the Christian missionaries to Japan could only begin to, or had to go around in a roundabout way, and they had to start teaching English. And it was through the teaching of English that they sort of kind of said, you know, there's also the gospel, incidentally. You want to see if you want to come for Bible study, that's okay. So these then, they founded schools and then universities, and these obviously attracted intellectuals. And they themselves, the missionaries themselves in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were very well educated people. And so it was a good link. By the way, Canadians were also involved in this, in the founding of Kwansei Gakuin in Kobe, and also Toyo Ewa, a women's school in Tokyo. So again, question, why is John Howes, a graduate of the US Navy Language School in World War II, why does he become an academic specializing in Japan? And you know, this is not quite as obvious as it may seem. So where do we go to discover the origin of his enthusiasm and skills? And well, we know where he obtained his skills, but what is the origin of his enthusiasm? And so I'd like to just switch now to another slide. I don't know if I can do it. Do you see this gentleman? No, that's an early one. Sorry. I'm not very good at this. It is very fussy. Can we get this guy with the beard there? Sorry. One more. Ah, yes, okay. So, I'm sorry, I insulted the ancestor. This gentleman is William Charles Foreman. And William Charles Foreman was, I think, John's great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. He is originally from Kentucky, and he's a Presbyterian minister. And he had this idea in Kentucky that he wants to teach literacy to slaves. And believe it or not, he actually got a lot of the slave owners to agree to this, but he wasn't making much headway. And of course, I think just thinking of it in terms of someone who has some basic knowledge of applied linguistics, it's very, very difficult to teach adults literacy. It's really a challenge. So that may have been part of it, but in any case, he goes off and he becomes a missionary in India. And he, at that time, Lahore was a part of India, it's now Pakistan, and he founds Foreman Christian College. And this Foreman Christian College, I looked it up and discovered that Pakistan's presidents, prime ministers, Supreme Court justices, and a few other influential people all seem to have graduated from this college. And there's more. John's cousins. One taught the history of Christian missions at Yale Divinity School. Another worked as a missionary in Chengdu in China until 1949, when he was, he was expelled by the communists. Not to be, shall we say, not to be set back by this, he goes off to Chiang Mai in northern Thailand and helps to found Payap International University, which still functions there. John often mentions his illustrious great-grandfather, his work in India, and the fact that mother and grandmother had been born in Uttar Pradesh. That is another part of India where another family member was active. And as a matter of fact, at home back in Chicago and Hinsdale, John recalled female relatives speaking to each other in Hindi. I guess they had to discuss something that they didn't want the children to hear. I don't know. But in any case, I'm citing this for the fact that he had role models. The idea of speaking a truly foreign language, one that is graded 4 on a scale of 4 by the Foreign Service Institute in Washington. I sometimes think it should be graded 6 or 7 on the scale of 4, but that's okay. But still, he didn't feel that this was an unnatural act. And so when war broke out, and the idea was, well, wait a minute, if you volunteer for the Navy, they will let you finish your year in college, and then you can do officers training, and then you can go to language school, and you will learn Japanese. That was the initial foreign language that they were going to ask a certain number, about just under 3,000 non-Nisei Americans with a high level of college education. Phi Beta Kappas were preferred. There was a Nisei school as well, which was very active and which actually was very, very effective. And however, there was an Army officers training program at Ann Arbor and a Navy one at Boulder, Colorado. And John joined the one at Boulder, Colorado, where his predecessors had been Donald Keene, Edward Seidensticker, and a long list of very prominent later Japan scholars. However, John spoke very admiringly of people he referred to as BIJ, born in Japan, or Mish kids. These were also at the naval school, in many of the schools. Some were actually instructors, and some were just simply students improving their Japanese, and they had a head start, obviously. So, so there is a kind of a misconception that it's a rather common one, that somehow all of these people who were these very bright kids who were going to volunteer to do Japanese language or Chinese or later other languages of the Far East, that they would all become very proficient, and they'd all become professors. And surely as the sun rises in the east, that the United States would have this wonderful cadre of brilliant speakers who will interpret Japan and the East at universities. Well, that's not quite what happened. When I was a reporter in Tokyo, one day I had to take around, it must be in the 1970s, early 80s, a by then rather prominent American political commentator called Joseph Kraft. And he was a very inspiring person. I mean, he had a syndicated column. He was definitely someone well worth spending a few days with. At the end of all of this, he says, you know, Andrew, I really appreciate what you did for me, but you won't believe this, but one time I actually did study this language. I spoke it somewhat. Well, it turned out he'd been one of the language schools. And then he said, but you know, after VJ Day, we just threw our dictionaries away. We're really happy to get out of there. And you know, well, basically what they did was they went back to the East Coast to pursue promising careers. And when you think about it, Japan was a defeated nation. These people didn't see any hope whatsoever of making a career in Japan. They knew that, you know, East Coast United States, Wall Street, that's where they were originally intended before the war got in the way. 80% of them did this, literally throw away their dictionaries. The remaining 20%, I get this from informal sources at Boulder, about 20% went into some kind of Japan-related career. Not necessarily Japan, because some of them were in Chinese and others, but basically 80% did not do that. So who did it, okay? Well, now we can discuss it very openly. A very large number of people of a sexual orientation that would have gotten them in trouble had they remained in the United States. They were gays. And so Seidensticker, Keene, and a very long list. And they've, of course, had a very powerful incentive to become proficient because they were what you might call integrative learners, people who wanted to actually know this culture better. The others were what you would call instrumental learners. These people were motivated in order to achieve a goal with the language. And once that goal disappeared, they were no longer motivated at all. By the way, this is not my original idea. This is Gardner and Lambert, their groundbreaking work on language motivation, which was done, by the way, in Montreal in 1970s. So anyway, the point is that John was motivated by the missionary background in his family. He really wanted desperately to get to Japan, and for two reasons. One was he knew that simply studying the language in a textbook, from a textbook, even with the best of well-intentioned teachers, which they had, this skill would atrophy without the stimulus of real relationships in a real-life situation. And he knew that very well, so he signed up immediately to go to Japan to participate in the occupation. Now comes another slide. And here we have Navy Lieutenant, junior grade, John Foreman House. And this is what in America they call a curveball, because, you know, this gives you the impression that this is how he worked and this is what it was like. No, no, no. He had this uniform made, and so that he could have this picture taken. And that was the last time he wore this, okay? And the reason for it is very simple. After leaving the Navy, where he was trained to speak Japanese or to also to read and decipher Japanese. He wanted desperately to go to participate in the occupation. The only trouble is that the occupation of Japan, if you remember, was headed by an army general called Douglas MacArthur, who really didn't like Navy people. And he didn't want a single one of them in the occupation. This was going to be entirely an army show. And so he had to go as a civilian employee. But that was a small sacrifice for him. And here he is, of course, he then becomes, he has one of those, what do you call it, experiences which are so character forming that, or so life changing that he talked about it very, very frequently. He was already working at SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers, in 1947, and he finds out that there was an intercept of a message from a clandestine radio station in northern Japan to obviously towards the Soviet Union. And in this clandestine, in this broadcast, the names, ranks, and everything else you wanted to know about 5 or 6 people working in the room across from his had been in the cast. And the result was that all 5 of them or 6 of them were immediately demobilized and sent home, because this was a breach of what do you call it, of security. Not long afterwards, somebody, John remembers him as a Canadian working for the occupation, goes up to him and says, "John, how would you like to have a new job?" And that was intelligence work. So he becomes an intelligence officer, although and his job is to oversee translations and documents and so on. But what does he do? Where is his real passion? This operative, this intelligence operative, what does he really do in Japan? He leads a Christian choir. That's where his heart would seem to be. And so he is, he also does a lot of work. He plays the organ. And one of his, he finds, he's walking down the Ginza, and one of the few buildings still standing on the Ginza, it happens to be a church, walks in and talks to the pastor, and discovers that they need sheet music. So using his best contacts, he contacts a sheet music publishing company in Chicago and obtains a Bach cantata for them. He also does a lot of charity work. He obtains a vehicle to work with. Actually, I think it's the Friends Service Committee, but I'm not sure. And he distributes old clothes that are sent from the United States for distribution. Then he returns to the United States, completes his university degree at Oberlin College, proceeds to Columbia for his MA, and that is where he begins his work on Uchimura. So let's see the next slide. So who are these people? This is John D. Rockefeller III, and this is Matsumoto Shigeharu. And these people become involved in John's life and vice versa in the following way. This is John is at Columbia, but he is given essentially $100,000 to run a program, or rather he's allowed to use part of $100,000 to start an exchange program, basically sending Americans to Japan and bringing Japanese to the United States in order to create people-to-people exchanges, essentially, it's part of I guess you could say, a Cold War policy to woo Japan away from the potentials of communism. But it's also long overdue because Japanese and Americans didn't get to know each other very well. Certainly, they didn't have good wartime memories. So, so what happens is that he discovers that it's very, very difficult to get Americans to go to Japan. First of all, they have other things to do. He does succeed in getting Eleanor Roosevelt to go, and he then is in charge of Ichikawa Fusai. I don't know how many people know who Ichikawa Fusai is, but she was a women's rights activist before the war who was mistakenly purged and then rehabilitated. And he obtained for her the services of a translator. And the interpreter happens to have been Beate Sirota Gordon. I don't know if this rings a bell to you, but she is the person who wrote a book about the equality clause, the gender equality clause in the American dictated post-war constitution. It was called, I think, The Only Woman in the Room. So, so in other words, promoting this kind of thinking about this kind of new policy of rapprochement between Japan and the United States was really quite challenging. Very few Americans wanted to go to Japan, and as far as wooing Japan and making it a bulwark of democracy in the fight against communism was not as easy as it might appear. So this was part of, I guess you could say, soft power diplomacy. An enormous amount of money was used in order to promote this kind of reconciliation between Japan and the United States. And John had a very prominent role to play in it. So ultimately, John becomes an employee of the International House of Japan, which is built by the Rockefellers. And there he oversees a budget and brings Japanese to the United States and vice versa, and continues his PhD on Uchimura Kanzo, who is a Japanese Christian pacifist. Ah, yes. I guess, how many people know the expression omiai? Okay, what's an omiai?
It's an introduction of potential partner.
Yes, and Japanese like to do that, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes. Well, this is John House and his future bride being introduced Japanese style in this way in a Japanese Christmas party in 1954, I think 55, okay? And this is, I don't know if there's a film called When John Met Lynn, but there should be. This is the one. Let me just continue there. This is, of course, their, I'm leaping ahead a little bit. This is when John and Lynn go off to Japan for John to take up his post at International House. And at a certain stage, not very long after this, he discovers that he's not getting any younger, and he really should start a family, and he would like to have a career as a Japan specialist, specializing in Japanese, especially Uchimura Kanzo and Nitobei Nazo. So he starts looking for a job, and shock and surprise, he gets one. Well, first of all, before that, I'd like to show you another picture, which is very nice. This is of their time at International House. International House, by the way, was built by John D. Rockefeller. 85% of the funds came from Rockefeller. 15% were raised within Japan. The idea was that it shouldn't be an all-American show. And John was recruited as a what do you call it? As an assistant director. Incidentally, I'm leaping a little bit backwards, but John D. Rockefeller, as a young man, traveled to Japan in 1929. And that's where they first met Matsumoto Shigeharu, who at that time was was working for Nitobe Inazo. And Nitobe was the head of the Japan Committee of the Institute of Pacific Relations, which kind of takes us full circle, because guess what? William Holland is now head of the department at UBC, and he gets an application from John Howes, who happens to be, of course, working on Japanese Christians in intellectual exchanges in Japan. And next we know is that he is here in Japan. And he's hired as a professor. Sorry? 10-minute warning. Well, it'll be, I'm kind of trying to bring all these strands together. And this is Bill Holland, who was originally at IPR, which was hounded out from New York by the anti-communists, who claimed that the Institute of Pacific Relations was infiltrated by communists and was responsible for the loss of China to, and so on and so on. And here is former intelligence officer John F. Howes. And, you know, it's former intelligence officer John F. Howes was not particularly interested in hounding out anybody from anywhere. He was interested in Japanese history, and UBC was starting a history department. I mean, starting at the Asian Studies department, and sure enough, they, as a matter of fact, from what I understand, quite aside from the idea that 3,000 graduates of the naval and army intelligence schools would all become Japanese specialists. On the contrary, John was the only applicant for this position to teach Japanese history, intellectual history in UBC in 1961. So much so that Bill Holland said, if I don't get another application, I'm going to have to teach it myself. So this, I'm telling you this to give you the idea of, you know, right now, Japan really is still the flavor of the month. If you want to do anime, you know, cosplay, whatever you want, it's all Japan. I was going to a bank the other day, and one of the staff there said, "Oh, I just spent a week in Japan. What were you doing?" "Oh, I went to Harajuku," and so on and so on. So it's very, very difficult for us to imagine how difficult it was for intelligent people with a desire to make peace through intellectual exchanges with Japan, how difficult it was immediately after the war to work towards that end. And it may not come as a surprise, therefore, that John was indeed decorated by the Japanese government, that his book on Uchimura won a prize from the Canadian government, and so on. Now, I would like to turn to two other people who are very important in the development of Japanese studies at UBC. This was before the founding of the department. This was Ronald Dorr and Kato Shuichi. And it was originally my idea that we should somehow bring these strands together. But I really think that each of them deserve another session because they were so important in the founding of Japanese studies here. I certainly owe an enormous debt of gratitude to both of them in different ways. Ronald Dorr, in case you are not aware of it, published like a dozen books on Japan, most of which are textbooks, were textbooks. So here is a flyer which is for a symposium which I had the honor of hosting as at that time the head of the Japan section of the Asia Foundation, and we invited. We discovered, of course, that Nitobe had almost a cult of Japanese who saw in him as a kind of internationalist who, had things turned out differently, might have prevented war in the Pacific or tried very hard at least. And he managed to be on the 5,000 yen note at between 1982 and I think 2000, I can't remember precisely, but about for 20 years. And I discovered by some surprise that there were several organizations, impromptu organizations in Japan, made up of people who were studying Nitobe Inazo. And you know, shock and surprise, we have the Nitobe Garden here. So we began talking, and so, you know, who were these people? Well, let me see now. One is at the time, the chief public prosecutor of Japan. He gave a presentation on what it's like for a Japanese to be an international person. The next person to talk was the rector, the president of Tokyo Joshidai, which was the name of which is Tokyo Women's Christian University in Japanese. And that university had as its first rector Nitobe Inazo. And she spoke about Nitobe and Nitobe's American wife, Mary. The next person was the deputy rector of Takushoku University, which was a university specially founded to promote colonial development, but has since become a general university. And he was, of course, very interested in the role that Nitobe played in colonial studies, for example, the development of Taiwan. The next person was at that time the deputy head of Tokyo Mitsubishi Bank. He later became the president of the bank. He had just a private interest in studying Nitobe, and so on and so on. And there, of course, we have John House and this other person at the bottom. So the point is this, that this internationalism, John was quite capable of really linking into it and understanding it in a way that was quite odd, because these people, and of course Nitobe, well, we have a garden here, but otherwise he's not that much of he's not so well known in Japan, in Canada, but in Japan, he is very much a kind of a positive symbol. So let me turn to a segment here, which might tell you a little bit more.
私はまず、稲造の生い立ちに大きな影響を与えた祖父、ニトベツトウのゆかりの地、三本木を訪ねました。青森県の東部に広がる三本木原、今の十和田市一帯は、130年ほど前までは八甲田の火山灰に覆われ、荒れるに任せた不毛の原野でした。この不毛の原野を開拓したのがニトベツトウでした。 南部盛岡藩の勘定奉行を務めていた津藤は、藩の財政立て直しのために、この三本木原の開拓を計画。十和田湖から水を引こうと、当時としては思い切った土木技術を導入し、5年の歳月をかけて、安政6年、ついに水路を完成しました。この三本木で初めて稲が実った翌年、文久2年、1862年、盛岡の新戸部家で津藤の孫が生まれました。稲の収穫にちなんで稲之助と名付けられたのが、後の新戸部稲造なのです。津藤の業績を伝える新戸部記念館で、私はカナダから来た一人の学者と出会いました。ブリティッシュコロンビア大学のジョン・ハウズ教授です。ハウズさんはどのような目的でこの記念館の方にいらっしゃって？
いや、実はですね、初めはです
はい
ね、新戸部稲造の研究をしながら、こういう記念館について聞きましたんで、そして記念館の方に来ますと、津藤はですね、とても大変な仕事をやったことがあった。新戸部稲造がですね、自分の先祖が大変いい仕事をしたと。で、これが本人には、精神的な負担になったんですね。で、未亡人の奥さんがそう言いました。つまり、稲造はとても義理固い人だったんです。で、自分の国に対する、自分の先祖の覚えに対する、自分が何にも役に立つことをしてないと。つまり、おじい様が偉いからですね、お父さんが偉いから。そういうような状態ですとですね、電気を書こうと思っている人がどうしても実はおじいさんとお父さん何をやったかと研究したいんです。
この番組の取材を私は2人の後輩、東京女子大の学生に手伝ってもらうことにしました。英文科4年の山口かなめさんと私学科3年の山本博子さんです。
山口かなめです。新戸部稲造と同じ盛岡出身です。山本博子です。私は新戸部稲造の青春時代に大変興味を持っています。
Okay, so point is that John is well known in Japan. No, the fact is that I think I'd just like sort of leave it at that way, and we can move to Q&A, and I'll try to respond as best as I can. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we do have a good half hour, I think, for questions and answers. And I also a belated welcome to all of the people that are with us online. I've neglected to mention that earlier, and I think they will have the opportunity to ask questions online as well, and we'll get those from Lisa. So the floor is open for questions. Please.
My question is not really about John Howard, but about Shinichi Kato. You mentioned his name about in the role he played in the Department of Studies. Would you mind expanding on this?
Okay, so actually, the department goes back to 1956, if I'm not mistaken, 55, 56.
61, technically.
Technically, yes.
Courses were taught before that.
That's right. Yeah. So yes, quite exactly. So courses were taught before that, but there was no department, and the people who were instrumental at that time were. I think it was Ronald Dorr. Ronald Dorr started he was, I think, in sociology, or if I'm not mistaken. And when he was going back to Britain, I think he went to Sussex, if I'm not mistaken, or SOAS, I can't remember. Sussex, I think, yes. He recommended someone take his place, and he recommended Kato Shuichi. Now, there is a story, that is the person you want to know about, Kato. Right? So well, I think it's funny. It's actually quite important that Kato at that time was already a very well-known intellectual in Japan. He had written widely, and but he was very, how can I put it? He had a medical degree, basically. And so it was largely on Ronald Doerr's kind of strong recommendation that he came, because he was going to teach classical Japanese, which is not, a medical degree is not normally what you have as a prerequisite to teaching classical Japanese. Although since I took one of his classes, I can tell you that it was very, very interesting. He knew. We did Konjaku Monogatari and so on, and it was challenging. I mean, for someone to not only be a medical doctor, someone who had gone to Hiroshima with the American team to do an assessment of the human cost of the bomb, and at the same time to be reading Konjaku Monogatari in 14th century Japanese, 13th century, I can't remember precisely. But I mean, it was like, I can't describe it. I mean, it's not like reading Latin, because Latin, you just read sort of left to right, whatever it is, and so on. But this stuff is arcane. I mean, it's Hebrew without the points, without the stuff at the bottom, and the little part, so on. It's really, really tough. And he could do that. He could also engage you in intellectual discussions on a wide range of issues. I went back to Japan, and I think must have been in, I forget, late 60s or so on. I turned on the television. It's Kato Shuichi taking Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre along through a garden in Kyoto. And it's on television, okay? So this is the kind of people that we had at that time. What's interesting though, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but what's interesting is that he had a medical degree, okay? And as for Ronald Doerr, who recommended him, he is famous for having been Ronald Doerr BA. I asked him one day, well, is that what you have? I mean, he was very, very kind. He said, well, actually, I have a PhD, but I never bothered to pick it up. And then I found out later that he'd actually written a book against credentialism. And it was a point that he would not pick it up. And Edward Seidensticker was another person like that, who didn't want to be known as Dr. Seidensticker. He just had a BA. So he was very, very wary of credentialism, and he was he lived that. As for Kato Shuichi, he was, well, what can I tell you? He was a wonderful, wonderful man. I had a falling out with him once because I said a joke in class, and I didn't realize that in Japan, you, the student, do not joke. You do not say jokes in the class. And I think it was something crazy, stupid, like he was talking about philosophy, like, ippan tokobutsu, the general and the specific. And he said, ippan, this is a general thing, and cats do not talk was one of the things he said. We were having allegedly a lecture in Japanese literature. And so I made reference to a Natsume Soseki novel called I Am a Cat, in which a cat talks. And I said, well, what about that? Waga hai wa neko de aru. And he looked at me and said, Deteke! Get out! so I left. And the next time we met was at a memorial for Frank Langdon at I House, International House, which I should tell you that John D. Rockefeller funded 85%. That's the reason I had this on the slide there. And Matsumoto Shigeharu was the first director of that institute. So then, there was that memorial for him, and Kato Shuichi was there. And I think he was genuinely surprised that I was on a panel and that I actually gave a serious presentation. And he was very touched, and we had a kind of reconciliation. I don't know if I told you the story you wanted to hear, but that's, you know, if I didn't answer correctly, can you tell me something more specific? I did, okay. He was a wonderful guy. Go ahead. Yeah.
I might add that Dr. Kato was completely fluent in French and German as well.
Yes, that's right.
Completely fluent.
Yes.
Fully versed in literature and so on and so forth.
Yes, his Kato Sensei was actually, he went to Paris to study hematology when he was still a doctor. And in fact, he was on the joint American-Japanese team to Hiroshima in 1945, for which he was roundly criticized by left-wing intellectuals in Japan. But it was one of his sort of road to Damascus moments. He said, these Americans, they were on the same team with us. They wanted to know what happened. So, he went to France afterwards to do hematology, and then while in France, he started writing poetry, and he moved into literature. While he was here, I think he wrote a novel. I think it was Hitsujin no Uta, the Song of the Sheep, and he just, I mean, he was sitting in, he had an apartment on Beach Avenue, the first high-rise there, and looking out on English Bay, he'd be writing columns for the Asahi Shimbun, you know? I mean, we were really lucky to have people like this. We're still lucky to have people like this. So
Please.
Yeah, I have a question about Japanese culture and values. In fact, two questions. The first question is, I assume there was traditionally an old tradition or old values. The first question is anything left now, or has it been merged with Western values? The second question is, how can we understand that the world is terrible animosity? The United States and Japan within 10 years were very friendly, or appears to be very friendly, and developing business. Has it perhaps something to do with traditional Japanese values? Are they better or different in dealing with old grudges? I read my European history, and it never stops. Most of it between England, France, Sweden, Denmark goes on for hundreds. How can that be explained in the US?
I am really honored that you think that I can answer these questions. Do you have something simpler like world peace, you know? Thank you so much. Yeah, well, you know, this old versus new thing about Japan, it's almost in a way kind of constructed because well, you know, yes, for 250 years, there was not, actually less than 250 years, there was a period of isolation. And so then when Japan burst onto the scene, it looked so different. And this whole idea that everything in Japan is different has persisted. And what's really interesting is that it's also become part of the Japanese identity. Oh, you know, we're different. Gee, that's great. Look, you know, I mean, how Canadians would love to be different. You know, do you know that? You know, we're jealous because, you know, Japanese can be different in so many different ways. But people, you know, have you ever been mistaken for an American in Europe? Of course. So this idea of being different is so important for the for construction of identity. So I think the Japanese or many Japanese began to embrace this idea of being different. And as a matter of fact, a lot of Japanese aesthetics is based on being different from China, going back to the 13th century. I mean, you know, the Japanese idea of architecture, asymmetry, all rooms being of a different size and not fitting properly. That's really kind of, I don't know how it occurred, but when people and intellectuals start discussing it, oh, well, we're different from China. Everything there is all very nicely, neatly carved. We just sort of take a piece of clay and reshape it so it looks exactly like in nature, right? So this kind of differences is something which, differences is part of identity. And many of which, of course, as we now know, are constructed and nurtured because we want to be different from our neighbor. So old grudges, you talk about old grudges. Let me see. Have you been to the Middle East lately? They have a surplus. I mean, yes, yes. So when it comes to old grudges, I think when I think of John Howes and the sort of the religious in him, it was really, the whole idea was reconciliation. The idea not to repeat whatever happened in World War II. And I think that he had a lot of sympathy in Japan as well. Now, you yourself are pointing to something that I think very interesting. You want to have your unique identity, but you also want to have peace. How do you accomplish that? Ask someone in the European Union, because they're having trouble with it right now.
I apologize for tooting your horn, but you might be interested to know that amongst his many publications, he has an article on how is it that we don't see the same kind of European style historical reconciliation between Japan and South Korea. I recommend that to you. Yeah, 2007.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Next question. Mr. Redmond.
Tell us your first recollection.
Well, that's interesting. I think the first recollection was in Asian Studies 105, I think. It was the rice paddies lecture. And then as Roy Stars wrote in his evaluation, his appraisal of what it was like to be John's pupil, he mentioned that John's room was always, the door was always open. And he took the idea of the university being a student-centered place very, very seriously. You know, universities were about students. That's what he was. And as you know, he didn't really publish. I mean, he published a lot of papers, including one paper that I'm really still looking for because I don't think it ever was. I think it was only read in our class once, but he postponed a lot of his so-called academic work to his own detriment because he was so busy with officiating World University Service exchange, the exchange with Todai, the three-way exchange, Todai, Stanford, UBC. And then when I went to Michigan, again, and his recommendation, John found the money for it. You know, I mean, when you're, you know, this was, I mean, there was the missionary in him. So then you get to his works later on. I mean, he published everything way, you know, after he retired. So when did I first meet him? Well, you know, it's really difficult when you know someone starting in 1966, 65, and you last see him in 2014. When exactly was it I first met him? No, I think he was there with me all the time, and he still is with us today. Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question correctly. What about you? When did you first meet him?
Also in Asian Studies 205.
Yeah.
Which was one of the
205. You're right. It was 205. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Well, oh yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, one of the things that I remember about John very much was that he ran a fourth year course in Japanese topics of research. I can't remember precisely, but he let the students do most of everything and came in and commented. And I still remember that 2 or 3 of the papers that my fellow students wrote still are in my mind. And he made me aware of this thing called peer education. You remember things that your friends told you because you can trust them. The professor, he's going to give you a mark. You can't, we don't know. But he knew how to utilize these things very, very cleverly.
We have some questions from online I can share with you. And one from Joseph Caron.
Yes.
I believe Canadian ambassador to Japan at one point. Andrew, he says, it's a big question, compare your Japan attraction to John House's attraction. In 3 minutes.
Well, I can't speak for John because, but I do know that that John was very attracted by at first by Uchimura, and I think it had to do with the fact that he saw, well, okay, I think we have to go back to the Cold War. It's true that I think he had a personal fascination with Uchimura, but also if we go back to the 1950s, there was a desire to look for democratic origins, democratic roots in Japan to counter the wartime propaganda of Japan as sort of, like an Asian version of Nazi Germany and people all mechanical and, marching to the same tune and so on. No. We were looking for individualists. And I think in that sense, Uchimura was a prime example of an individualist because he refused to bow in front of the imperial script on education. He took a stand against the Russo-Japanese War. So I think, yes. I don't know if I'm answering Joseph's question, but that was his fascination. I thought that, well, there were all sorts of things that attracted me about Japan. Let's face it, I was 16, and 16-year-old boys are usually attracted to, well, sometimes, depending, the other side or some significant. So yes, there was that element too, but I was also very much interested in just Japanese cars had begun to come, and they look different. They really did look different. And I remember looking at these Datsuns, and well, that's what Nissan used to be called, and the Toyota Paprika, and which I thought at first was a misspelling of a Hungarian spice. And then, no, it was a Japanese English public car, okay? So that then begins my fascination with language. And actually, to be honest, it was the challenge of learning this language that for me was the whole thing. And it was related to a relationship that went wrong because my Japanese Canadian girlfriend sent me back all my letters to her. And so, and she implied that her father didn't really like white boys. And so I decided to myself, well, I know how to learn foreign languages. I learned English, and I can learn anything. So I decided to study Japanese. I went to Japan, learned Japanese as much as I could. 2 years later, I was on a boat to a particular harbor in the north where my ex-girlfriend was living, one of, I think, 2 Japanese Canadian families living there. And for some reason, the Japanese captain invited some Japanese on board, and he was there. And I ended up translating for her father.
Oh,
I don't think I was ever, I mean, I don't know whether reconciliation didn't take place, okay?
very good. Another question from the floor? Yes, please, the student? Yes.
So you talked about like throughout the whole time, you talked about like how he was a really good staff worker. I was wondering like, what do you think made him like really good with the staff worker?
You mean John House?
Yes.
I think we all have some things we're good at, okay? And if we're honest with ourselves, we really work towards that end. We know how to utilize that, to take advantage of what he would say God has given us. And John had a absolutely, a totally enviable capacity to make friends with with virtually everybody, you know? And I think that was one thing. And I mean, you know, take a look. This guy is this John is sitting in a occupation era building. They said there's no heating, there's nothing. They're working on they're working on make work intelligence projects, transliterating titles of books, you know, whatever. You know, his job was, I think, looking at military maps, Japanese military maps of northeastern China. And it was really exciting, like fresh water available here, you know. That's a real challenge for you and your Japanese, you know. So it's totally, completely disillusioned with this, walks down the Ginza, and there's a church, there's an organ, there's a pastor. He describes getting the Bach cantata, playing it at Christmas. And John says, you know, there was a church and the choir, and we'd just done it. And they said, he asked the pastor, so where is the congregation? And the pastor looked at the choir and said, that's it. He had a wonderful sense of humor, you know? And of course, yeah. Okay.
Please, Martha.
So we have a great deal about John as the networker.
Yes.
Do we know anything about who networked for him?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what do you mean precisely?
So when he applied to UBC, it was his interest in Nitobe, and Holly had known about that. And so that was perhaps good fortune. But, you know, John introduced so many, he made so many connections. And
yes.
He wrote about so many, you know, mega partners.
Yes.
But I'm wondering if we know anything about what sort of organizations or family connections supported John in the development of his career.
Okay. Yes. Well, first of all, I don't think I think it's on the Tad also. You heard the tapes. I mean, obviously you were there when the recording was done, right, Tad?
I remember 20 minutes or 50 hours of recording.
Thank you. I think that first of all, didn't you have to go to Washington to talk to Glenn Shaw? I'm not sure about that. But no, there were all sorts of connections in the missionary field.
Okay, missionary field.
So
I believe that it was actually a brother, not a cousin, who was a missionary.
that it was a cousin.
Was it a
Cousin, yeah.
I asked that correctly.
No,
But there was this sort of missionary.
the missionary connection was very, very strong. And now I'm trying to remember, but there was there were all sorts of connections that he had a network, and they were you know, no, it was I can't think anything right at the top of my head right now, but there was a lot there. Yeah.
Missionary in the church. That would answer my question.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
One last question, and then
Yes.
we're at 7:30. Who would like to ask the last question? Do I see your hand going up, sir? Yes.
Mark, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm working with mathematics for some new job, especially. I'm a Sugihara descendant, searching. I was in Tokyo, I think I was in mathematics. And then the Japanese businessman, wanted to get some lecture to Sugihara, so university. Science. And this Japanese businessman wanted to get a documentary about the studio. He wanted to encourage me. He showed me a documentary he made here at UBC with John Howes at the movie garden. What year was this? 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. Okay, all right.
No, okay, yes, there is that that documentary. It's available on YouTube. No, maybe no. I think it's available maybe on UBC or something. But no, maybe YouTube. It's YouTube. Yes. The reason I mentioned this, the reason I brought out this last documentary, which unfortunately I didn't translate, it was about John quoting Nitobe's widow, Mary, talking about how her husband was so how kind of driven because he felt that he had to live up to the expectations that his ancestors, that his ancestors had they'd actually irrigated this whole area, the area that the narrator goes through, the rice areas, and had brought prosperity to the fief. Plus, of course, he had all these other illustrious ancestors and he had this weight on his back. Of course, poor Nitobe, well, he only brought the sugarcane industry to Taiwan, taught university at Kyoto Imperial, was rector at Tokyo Women's University, founded the predecessor of UNESCO. And so obviously he couldn't possibly take a look at his ancestors. He was such an underachiever, you know? And so then I now remember why I had that on there, because you see the parallels with John's life. John talking about his great-grandfather who founded a university in Lahore, and his cousin who founded another one in Thailand. And, you know, and he talks about Nitobe, but I also had always the feeling that it was really about himself, that he also wanted to be a person who made the world a better place.
Thank you for bringing it full circle. I would like to close the Q&A session here. And before we go away, I want you to join me in thanking Andrew. And we do have a little bag of our department merchandise for you to take home, in addition to your honorary. And thank you all for coming, and good night. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.